What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review the brand new novel Heat 2 from director and now author Michael Mann, as well as author Meg Gardiner. Now, I've never read anything by Meg Gardiner, but I've seen a lot of movies by Michael Mann, and it is my pleasure to report that this novel is one of my favorite storytelling experiences of 2022 in any medium. While my first and only love in this life will always be movies, in that most movies tend to disappoint, I'm totally open to the idea that I'm going to have to look at television and video games and comics and fiction, etc., in order to kind of satisfy my storytelling cravings. And in this year, Top Gun Maverick was a very satisfying experience, or the video game Elden Ring was a very satisfying experience. Heat 2 was so good that at times I would just be laughing with joy, just exhilarated by the crackling dialogue and superb story construction. And like the last few sentences, and don't worry, I won't go into any spoilers initially, but the last few sentences, I just put the book down. I just started laughing uproariously because there's nothing more satisfying to me than a great story, whether somebody's telling you a joke or telling you a story or reading a book or whatever. And when you're in the hands of two storytelling giants, there's nothing else like it. So yeah, Heat 2 blew me out of the water. It vastly exceeded my highest expectations. I have to admit, I kind of didn't really have that high of, I guess I wasn't really looking forward to it that much because Michael Mann has had peaks and valleys in his filmmaking career, basically since Collateral. But this is a weird thing to do. A novel sequel to an epic Los Angeles crime saga. It's hard to think of many examples like that where a great classic in one medium has a sequel mixed in with a prequel in yet another medium where it really pays off. And obviously, Quentin Tarantino did an adaptation of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which was basically a different story that kind of fills in the gaps around that movie. This doesn't do the same approach, but it does kind of sort of fill in the gaps around Heat, which came out in 1995, because the story takes place in 1988, 1995, and in 2000, and it's got a lot of familiar faces, and it's got a lot of new faces, but the joy of it is that as you're reading it, there'll be certain lines of dialogue where suddenly Al Pacino and Robert De Niro circa 1995 would just explode in your imagination. But every once in a while, Vincent Hanna or Neil McCauley would say something where you're like, oh my God, the last 27 years have totally evaporated and I'm right there in the moment again. And I should also mention that when Heat first came out, that was the real beginning of my discovery of the great movies of De Niro and Pacino. I think every movie buff goes through a phase where they get really into Pacino. And with Pacino or De Niro, it's always well, you watching their stuff from the 70s or are you watching the stuff from the 90s when they had their resurgence and did a lot of good stuff again? And it is no exaggeration to say that my first and second year in college, I would have been happy to watch nothing but Al Pacino and Robert De Niro movies. I mean, I was watching movies like Goodfellas and Carlito's Way and Scarface and Taxi Driver, etc., just on a loop and just loving every second of it. And so Heat fell right at the perfect time where everybody was really primed to see that movie. But what's funny is how at that time I was just too young, dumb, and full of cum to appreciate it at the time. But over time, I have watched Heat many, many times, and now I believe I fully appreciate it for the genuine LA crime saga it is, for its look, its ensemble cast, for its tone, its mood. It's a beautiful film. And this novel does a brilliant job of enriching and enhancing that movie without contradicting any of it. But I think this book very successfully lets the movie be the movie and is much more concerned with telling three other stories. It's 1988, where were Hanna and McCauley at that time and what were they up to? And then it also has a story of what is the aftermath for Chris after he successfully escapes at the end of Heat. How does he reinvent himself? What is his new life going to be? And then the book closes out with an absolutely astonishing story set in Los Angeles in 2000 where a lot of these characters start to interact again. And I guess if I were to offer one criticism of the book, and it's not even really a criticism, it's just a note, perhaps this book makes it a little bit too easy for this vast cast of characters to keep bumping into one another and instantly recognizing each other in spite of all the various lives they've been leading. I mean, it's an enormous cast of characters because everybody who is alive at the end of Heat is back, but we also have a bunch of new faces. In particular, there's one villain who makes even Waingro seem pretty tame by comparison. I mean, the villain in this book is just sinister to the core, and it's going to give people a lot of post-traumatic stress when they read about some of his exploits, but he is a worthy adversary for all these characters. But let me try and slow this video down and put a little structure to it, because right now I'm just vomiting praise all over it, but it is well-deserved. But let me just try to organize my thoughts a little bit. So let's start with the basics. If you have a podcast or a blog or a YouTube channel or anything where you're reviewing shows, movies, etc., you spend most of your time trying to figure out what's the best use of my time, what's the best stuff to be covering, should I follow my passion, should I follow this up with clicks, should I follow current events? But the moment I read the first page of this book, I was like, all right, for the next 24 hours, there is nothing I'd rather be doing than reviewing and reading and covering this book, because if you go out prospecting for gold and then you hit the mother lode, it's like, all right, it gives you a wonderful sense of purpose when you find something that's amazing, where you're completely invested and you know that you found that perfect sweet spot where something is new, it's topical, and it's also something you can be wildly passionate about all at once. And it's incredible to me how the story is the gift that just keeps on giving. For people who don't know, Michael Mann was friends with Charlie Adamson and his partner Dennis Farina way back in the day when they all lived in Chicago. And they would tell him all these stories from the late 60s about these real-life characters who ultimately would end up inspiring the characters of Neil and Vincent. And part of what gives Michael Mann's movies like Thief or Heat or any of his crime films or Manhunter or LA Takedown, part of what gives them this feeling of authenticity are all these stories that he was absorbing about Chicago. And that's what this book and his movies always have. And this incredibly rich feeling of authenticity, this attention to detail that just brings these worlds to life. Because if you're a movie fan or a TV fan or whatever, most of the cop shows or stories you get exposed to are basically very diluted, very superficial ripoffs of classics of the past. It's very rare that they employ new details that really give him a specific flavor or style. And Charlie Adamson, to his credit, would go on to actually have a successful career in television, where he got to work with Michael Mann as a producer, and obviously Dennis Farina had an amazing acting career and a ton of cool shows and movies. But to see these tales go from true life stories being verbally exchanged to a TV movie, LA Takedown, which is like a bare bones skeletal version of Heat, and then to see Michael Mann only a few years later take LA Takedown and flesh it out and give us this movie masterpiece of Heat. And now finally to see Heat living and breathing, where's my book? Living and breathing and thriving as a novel. And it's a whopper. It's like, nearly 500 pages. You could club someone to death with it. I guess what I'm trying to get to is that it's very rare and unusual to see a story evolving and changing and growing across multiple mediums, television, film, and fiction, and be so successful on all those fronts. And in the end, what makes all these stories so successful is that Vincent Hanna and Neil McCauley are just riveting characters. I mean, obviously, these stories have a very deep bench of incredible characters, and obviously from the film, I mean, I love seeing Wes Studi in the mix, and I love seeing Danny Trejo in the mix, love seeing Natalie Portman in the mix, and Tom Noonan, John Voight, Val Kilmer. I mean, the list goes on. And for everybody out there who likes Val Kilmer's characters, Chris Shaherlis, I've always been a little iffy on how to pronounce that last name. I'm just going to call him Chris. But if you're a fan of Val Kilmer's character, well, Heat 2 is going to make you very happy, because a big part of the joy of this book is getting a lot of stories where he is front and center, where he doesn't really escape the shadow of Neil, but he gets to be his own man with his own agenda, with his own ambitions, as opposed to being kind of like a wingman who needs to be looked after, because obviously Neil McCauley casts a very long shadow. But a lot of this book takes place after Neil McCauley's death at the end of Heat. But if I were to call attention to my favorite aspect of this book, it does this brilliant thing where you will feel like Vincent Hanna at times, where you're chasing that rush. Because as everybody knows, Michael Mann's great at showing these characters where money is not necessarily what drives them. It's part of what drives them, but they're all chasing that fix. They're all chasing that adrenaline dump where they love the score, or they love taking down the bad guy. Like, they're completely addicted. And you will be as addicted as Vincent Hanna to chasing down bad guys as you're reading this. And I had to physically force myself to hold the pages down and slow down and read and savor the book line by line, because you're just going to want to know what happens. You're going to want to know what happens. And when he's snorting lines or popping pills and getting like a whiff of a clue, and he'll hear one little detail, and it's like in his detective brain, like he's off. He's like, oh my god! And when he like a bloodhound, when he gets on the trail, it's so goddamn exciting because he's a flawed character, but he's a kick-ass hero. But he's not your typical boring white knight. He's basically like a drug addict with a strong moral compass. And it's just exhilarating reading anything and everything with Vincent Hanna. And once again, Al Pacino was just screaming off the page. And there are little lines like, don't waste my motherfucking time from Heat, where those lines aren't exactly as they were in the movie, but they are similar enough where, once again, it's impossible not to see Al Pacino's face just screaming at you as you read the book. The dialogue in this book really is a thing of beauty, and you can probably read the first half of the first page to get a real sense of just how strong the dialogue is, because it opens with a very brief recap of the major events of the movie, and it's like, oh my god, y'all just took this 3-hour crime saga and boiled it down to a few bullet points and made it feel just as badass and just as hardcore as the movie itself. It's like, all right, wherever this story goes, I'm on board. I think my favorite story in the many stories, in a lot of ways, it's almost like a collection of different novellas or vignettes that eventually all tie together. But the stuff in 1988 in Chicago is so goddamn cool, where we see a younger Vincent Hanna and a younger Neil McCauley who don't know each other yet at play, and there's another major player who emerges as the great villain of the story, of the novel, at work as well. That's where the book really shines for me, but goddamn, it's hard to beat like the last fourth of it, which is all in LA in 2000, which is what everything is leading to. That is all incredibly rich, strong material. But if you're a big Neil McCauley buff, you're going to be thrilled as well, because you get to see Neil and his being a consummate pro all over again. Anytime somebody is late or too curious or too nosy or too unreliable, you really get to see him put them in their place, and that's so incredibly satisfying. And you get to see him and Trejo and Chris and basically their crew. I'm blanking on Tom Sizemore's character's name. Michael Cerrito. You basically get to see their crew in their prime doing a big job down in Mexico that goes kind of horribly, horribly wrong. And it's just, anyway, if you want action, if you want bloodbaths, this book has bloodbaths aplenty. So as a reader, your mileage will vary depending upon which characters you're obsessed with, because for a lot of diehard Heat fans, it's the smaller, minor characters on the side that really get their juices flowing. So if you want to see more stories about Kelso, the character played by Tom Noonan, brilliantly played by Tom Noonan, you're going to be happy. Or if you want to see Drucker evolving and growing into a badass cop in his own right, you're going to be really happy. So it's just great seeing all these side characters getting their due, I guess, more screen time than they had in the original film. Or the character played by John Voight, Nate. Nate's incredible in this as well. Everybody's incredible in this, just a question of to what degree. But in the end, it all boils down to who's cooler, Neil or Vincent. I would argue that in this book, Vincent is cooler, but obviously a lot of my personal bias might be at play there as well. So I'm starting to realize that my attempt to add some structure to this video has completely and utterly failed. Let me try to get into some specifics without giving away spoilers, where I just review it objectively as a crime story, because in the end, no matter what nostalgia you feel for Heat, the book has to live and thrive on its own as a standalone story, and it does two things really well. When it comes to detective work, the nitty-gritty of gathering data and comparing and contrasting and organizing it, it's like 90%, elbow grease and paperwork, and then 10% adrenaline once Vincent gets on the trail of something. And that's beautifully rendered and beautifully brought to life throughout the course of this book. Just getting into the weeds on what detective work is all about. Or the nitty-gritty of what it's like planning a big score. If you want to rob a bunch of safety deposit boxes, or if you want to rip off a Mexican drug cartel, it takes careful planning. So this book, it really leans into and embraces all the careful planning and the professionalism, being good at what you do, being a pro. That's what Neil and Vincent are all about. But what I also liked is how this book did not shy away from the darkest elements of human beings, where I feel like so many movies and shows just feel vanilla, they feel diluted, they feel afraid to go there. This book almost goes there too much with some of the sexual violence. I mean, well, like I said, there is a villain, and I can't name his name because his name changes throughout, but it's all the same guy. His MO, what drives him, the same way that Neil and Vincent are driven by their passion, this villain is driven by his passion, and it's just so dark and so disturbing. But the book needs that, and I feel like crime fiction needs that, and crime movies need that, and that's an area where so many movies and shows miss the mark. And I think Michael Mann and his co-author Meg Gardiner excel at figuring out what makes a character tick, what drives them, what are they into, what gives them the juice. Is that like Chris is a young man and his gambling problem? That is something that makes him get up and go. And then when he meets Charlene, and we get some really kick-ass sexual scenes in this book as well, Charlene really makes Chris get up and go. Yeah, I guess, yeah, I can't believe I haven't mentioned that yet, but this book is very mature when it comes to human relationships, and it's not like some like softcore porn book, but it's also a relief to see a story that is very open and honest about how sex is one of those areas that really drives people in so many ways, or it can fuel your ambition in other areas of your life, because if you succeed in those endeavors, then that might lead to more sex, etc., and so forth. And if you like crime fiction, if you like hard-boiled fiction, if you like film noir, this book is littered with great scenes with like people doing lines and fucking in an alleyway as like police sirens whiz by and that sort of thing. It's like, yeah, that is vintage crime. That is vintage noir. Like you can see it in your mind. And Michael Mann has such a great eye and has such a great distinctive look to his films. You are going to see these scenes in your mind just exploding, especially during the action scenes. They are so vividly rendered, and the violence is so specific and so well choreographed. It's a shame we can't wind the clock back 27 years and have all these actors reunite and make a big, giant sequel to Heat, but this, because it's in our imagination, it's almost better than any movie could ever be, because Robert De Niro and Al Pacino and Val Kilmer, they will all be young and beautiful and virile and in their prime in our imaginations forever. Another area where this book excels is reminding us and not letting us forget that these are career criminals in many cases, and they are more than happy to put a bullet in your head if you get in their way, no matter how charismatic they might be, no matter how addicted we might be to their stories. These are dangerous sociopaths in a lot of ways, and so while it is like that's absolutely riveting seeing how professional Neil can be, if you get in his way during a score, you are going down, as they like to say. Or I guess maybe that's more of like an Al Pacino line. But this book does not gloss over the fact that we are talking about people who have antisocial tendencies, to put it mildly. So yeah, there's no area where this book feels like it's pulling punches. That's incredibly satisfying. And along those lines, the actual villains of the story, like the true dark, evil sociopaths, initially, it will appear as if perhaps this novel is reveling in some really gory details, almost to the point where it's like, are y'all getting off just writing this? But structurally, this is all part of the villain's MO, his modus operandi, like what drives him and what are the telltale signs that will help a detective identify him years after the fact. Because if you have a certain weird, kinky thrill that you do when you're torturing and murdering or castrating your victims, if you kill somebody the exact same way 12 years later, well, boom, you're going to pop up on the radar, someone like Vincent. So that was another interesting thing, where all the little gory details were not only there to shock and horrify the reader, but they really have a purpose structurally over the course of the giant narrative. All right, so this last bit of praise definitely veers into spoiler terrain. So if you want to go in completely cold and clean to this novel, bail out now. But it's incredibly satisfying seeing how all roads lead to Los Angeles, because Heat is not a crime saga. It's not like an ordinary crime saga. It's an LA crime saga. And that is a very different thing from a Chicago crime saga. And that's a very different thing from a New York crime saga. Like, these big cities all have a different flavor, a different mood, a different style. A movie like To Live and Die in L.A. is going to be a very different movie from French Connection, even though you have the exact same director, William Friedkin, making those two classic crime movies. And Heat 2 does an incredible job of luring and pulling all these different characters back to Los Angeles. And there will be times where you're like, oh my God, like it's really convenient that all these characters who have not seen each other in years suddenly are interacting or recognizing each other. But it doesn't break the story. It never broke my ability to be totally invested. And it was incredibly satisfying when you see Vincent's emotional reaction to thinking about Neil again for the first time in years and seeing what an impact Neil had on his life as he figures out and learns what drove Neil to have that discipline that he described so eloquently in the diner sequence. How did Neil become that way? Because Neil wasn't born that way. Neil became that way, and we will learn together as we read the story what drove Neil to have that attitude towards no attachments that was so defining to his character. But the book doesn't wallow in nostalgia, it doesn't wallow in sentimentality. While a lot of the classic scenes from Heat are referenced and are definitely part of the backdrop, this is a brand new story that pulls all these characters forward. And while one of the major stories is in 88, it's just there to kind of set the stage for all the stuff that's going to come later on. And I love stories where you find out what happens next. I get really tired of movies and shows that are just prequels where you know nothing really is going to happen to these characters because we know they need to be alive at the end for what comes next. And you might be thinking the same thing during the 1988 sections. Well, I know Neil and Vincent are going to be alive in 7 years, but once again, it's just the backdrop. It informs and enriches the payoffs that are going to come later on. And it is interesting seeing how Neil became Neil. But not only do we get a great story about what happens next for all these characters in 2000, when you get to the end of it, you're going to want more. You're going to, God damn it, bring on Heat 3 right now. And one detail that really brought 1995 roaring back to me, I can remember one of my friends describing Heat and what he loved about it, and he was describing Val Kilmer in that LA battle scene and his posture and the way he was standing and the way he was shooting back and forth and just how badass he looked. And a lot of Val Kilmer's performance in that moment informs how the cops in the story are able to recognize him. Like when you're watching a surveillance tape and you see him in that posture, that is what makes Chris crisp. I was like, oh my God, like it's incredible seeing how cops in this book in 2022 are noticing the same details that my buddy did back in 1995. But maybe I'm starting to ramble. Like, I mean, I've got so many fucking notes that I wrote down, but maybe this video's gotten long enough at this point. Maybe I should just wrap it up and just tell people definitely read the book. And if you've not read a book in a good long while and you're, thinking, maybe I need to read more books. If you're going to read any brand new novel in 2022, not that I've got like a whole bunch of other books to compare and contrast with. I've read a few books that have come out this year, but usually when it comes to my reading, I read books from any given year, whatever I feel like reading. But read a couple nonfiction books this year, like Red Carpet and The End of the World is Just the Beginning. But if you want to read a brand new piece of lurid, exciting, dynamic, violent, sexual fiction with incredible dialogue and memorable characters that has incredible tie-ins to a classic movie, Heat 2, baby. It ain't going to disappoint. And along those lines, let me give a shout out to my sponsor, Manscaped, the world's foremost experts in men's below-the-waist grooming. Their products are precision-engineered tools for your family jewels. Join over 4 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped with this exclusive offer for you, 20% off and free worldwide shipping with the code WRONGREEL at manscaped.com. Wrong Reel is my podcast where Manscaped is the official sponsor, but I'm all about plugging and promoting that discount code over here as well. So if you've been enjoying my YouTube channel, my podcast for a good long while, consider going to manscaped.com and using the promo code WRONGREEL, and I'll leave a link in the description below for your convenience. But hope you enjoyed this video. Hope this has encouraged some people to read the book. Hope this has encouraged some people to go back and rewatch Heat. I'm planning on watching Heat tonight, and I can't fucking wait. And if you want to talk more about Heat or Michael Mann or whatever, give me a shout on Twitter at Geeking Out. But it's just so cool to see a filmmaker who has kind of struggled in recent years with his output. I mean, he's making his Ferrari film now, so Michael Mann is officially back. But it's just great to see a filmmaker who I love and admire, who's made some of my favorite movies, like Last of the Mohicans, delivering one of his best stories ever. I can't wait to give this book a place of honor on the bookshelf behind me. So on that note, I'm wrapping up this video. Please remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.